She wanted out of this town. I wanted her to stay forever. Welcome to the world of Western romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The heat of the afternoon was a physical weight, pressing down on the single dusty street of Harmony Gulch and seeping through the clapboard walls of the general store until the very air within seemed to hum with a lethargic energy. For it was the sound of stagnation, a monotonous drone that matched the slow ticking of the regulator clock on the wall and the lazy buzz of the flies that orbited the pickle barrel. She stood behind the long oak counter, the scent of canvas, coffee beans, and her father's pipe tobacco as familiar to her as her own skin, methodically wiping down a surface that was already clean. Every sweep of her rag felt like a wasted motion in a life full of them, a life she was planning, coin by painstaking coin, to leave behind. Her gaze, as it so often did, drifted past the shelves stacked high with bolts of calico and tins of peaches, past the sacks of flour and sugar, to the sun-bleached train schedule tacked by the door. The paper was curled at the edges and smudged with fingerprints, but the bold black letters spelling out San Francisco were a beacon, a promise of fog-laden sea air, gaslit boulevards, and the exhilarating anonymity of a crowd. It was a world away from this place, where every face was known and every story had been told 1,000 times over, a place where she felt her own story had been written for her before she'd even had a chance to pick up the pen. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a roadmap of prairie hardships, pushed a small list across the counter, her voice a reedy whisper as she asked for salt and yeast. Smiled, a practiced and pleasant motion that didn't quite reach her brown eyes, and moved with an efficiency that had been drilled into her since childhood. As she weighed the salt, the faint clink of metal on metal from Mrs. Gable's meager coin purse was a sharp reminder of her own hoard, the growing collection of tips and saved wages hidden away in a biscuit tin under a loose floorboard in her room. With each transaction, she performed a small, secret ritual, palming a stray coin, and when no one was looking, slipping it through a crack in the counter into a small box she kept on a lower shelf. It was a desperate, hopeful act, a tiny rebellion against the suffocating permanence of her existence. Her father, sitting in his usual chair by the window, lowered his newspaper just enough to watch her. He saw the far-off look in her eyes as she stared at the train schedule, the subtle, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, and his heart ached with a familiar, quiet sorrow. He knew he was watching a bird beating its wings against the bars of a cage, even if that cage was a home he had lovingly built. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the afternoon's haze and announced an arrival far more significant than that of any regular customer. Edward strode in, bringing with him the scent of horse and leather and the clean, vast emptiness of the open range. He was a tall man, built with the solid, unassuming strength of someone who worked with his hands and his back from sunup to sundown, and his presence seemed to command the space without any effort at all. He pulled the dusty brown hat from his head, his dark hair damp with sweat at the temples, and nodded a greeting to her father before turning his attention to the counter. A slow smile touched his lips as he looked at her, a smile that knew her, that had seen her through pigtails and skinned knees and the awkwardness of her first town dance. His eyes, a deep and steady blue, held a warmth that she found both comforting and intensely irritating. To her, Edward was Harmony Gulch made flesh. He was the unyielding mountains that ringed the valley, the deep-rooted loyalty of its people, the steadfast, predictable rhythm of the seasons. He was everything she admired and everything she was desperate to escape. He leaned against the counter, his nearness creating a current in the still air, and began his usual routine of gentle provocation. He didn't just ask for a sack of oats. He launched into a detailed and entirely fabricated story about his prize mare, Clementine, suddenly developing a refined taste for imported French cuisine and refusing her usual feed, a tale he spun with a completely straight face while watching for the inevitable crack in her composure. Refused to give him the satisfaction of a laugh, maintaining a stern facade as she heaved a 50-pound sack onto the counter with a deliberate thud, though she couldn't suppress the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. Their banter was a well-worn path, a series of familiar jests and feigned exasperation that was as much a part of her daily life as the setting sun. Yet, beneath the teasing, She felt the weight of his gaze, an intensity that went beyond simple neighborly affection. He wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing her, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the restless energy in her hands, the flicker of longing in her eyes as they strayed once more to the train schedule. He saw her dream, and unlike her father, there was no sadness in his expression, only a quiet, resolute challenge, a silent question that asked why the sky above his ranch wasn't big enough for her. The comfortable rhythm of the day was shattered by the bell's second ringing, announcing a presence utterly alien to the rustic simplicity of the store. The man who stepped inside was not of their world. His suit was of a fine, dark wool that seemed to absorb the light, immaculately tailored and free of the dust that coated every other soul in town. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, his face was clean-shaven, and a silk tie was knotted perfectly at his throat. He moved with a liquid grace, his eyes, the color of shrewd gray slate, sweeping the room with an air of immediate and total assessment before they landed, with calculated precision on. He introduced himself as Sterling, his voice a smooth and cultured baritone that was a stark contrast to the gruff, sun-baked tones of the local men. He spoke of progress and prosperity, painting a dazzling picture of a future where a railroad spur would connect Harmony Gulch to the rest of the country, bringing with it commerce, opportunity, and a new era of civilization. His words were like a siren song, too, each one validating the secret, whispered desires of her heart. He spoke of a world she had only read about in dog-eared novels, a world of ambition and innovation where a person's future wasn't dictated by the plot of land they were born on. As he spoke, he directed his compliments to her, his gaze unwavering and appreciative, likening her to a rare desert flower blooming in obscurity. He didn't see a simple storekeeper's daughter. He saw potential, a spirit that matched his own, and he made no secret of it. He purchased a few small, unnecessary items, his gloved fingers brushing hers as he passed over the coins, a touch that was both fleeting and electric, leaving her with a sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. This man was not a part of the dust and the quiet desperation. He was the embodiment of the world she yearned for, a golden key that had just walked through her door. From his post by the sacks of grain, Edward had watched the entire exchange, his posture shifting from relaxed to rigid, his expression hardening into a mask of quiet appraisal. He was a man who understood the subtle language of the wild, the way a coyote circles before it strikes, the false stillness of a rattlesnake, and his instincts were screaming that Sterling was a predator of a different, more dangerous sort. He noted the way Sterling's charm never quite reached his cold, assessing eyes, the way his promises of prosperity were carefully worded to offer spectacle without substance. When the man finally departed, leaving a faint, foreign scent of expensive cologne in his wake, Edward pushed himself off the grain sacks and approached the counter. The easy, teasing light was gone from his eyes, replaced by a serious, protective fire. He saw the dazed, hopeful expression on her face and felt a profound sense of foreboding. He chose his words carefully, his voice low and steady. "Some things that glitter ain't gold," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "They're just broken glass in the sun, pretty to look at they cut you." The warning, meant to shield her, landed like an insult. All the pent-up frustration of her constrained life, all the resentment she felt toward the town and its people for not understanding her, coalesced into a hot flash of anger. To her ears, Edward's words were not a caution but an accusation, another attempt to clip her wings and keep her grounded in the dust she was so desperate to escape. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was sharp with a bitterness that surprised them both. "You're just like everyone else," she retorted, her hands clenched into fists on the countertop. "You can't stand the thought that I might want more than this, that someone might see something in me besides a girl to run a register and sweep a floor." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. A line had been drawn, a wedge driven deep into the foundation of their long, complicated friendship, and in the sudden, wounded silence, felt a terrible, triumphant pang of liberation, unaware that she had just pushed away her staunchest ally and taken her first step toward a far more dangerous mirage. The days that followed Sterling's arrival unfolded for like pages from one of the fantastical novels she kept hidden beneath her mattress, each moment shimmering with a gilded promise that made the mundane reality of Harmony Gulch seem increasingly drab and unbearable. Sterling, with the practiced ease of a master angler, began his courtship not with grand, overt gestures that might spook the townsfolk, but with a steady, intoxicating stream of small considerations that were aimed directly at the heart of her deepest longings. He would appear at the general store not as a customer, but as a confidant, leaning against the counter to share stories of the grand theaters in Boston, describing in vivid detail the weight of velvet curtains and the breathtaking sight of 1,000 gaslights igniting at once, making her feel as though she were standing right there beside him. He brought her not jewels, but a simple silk ribbon the color of a twilight sky, telling her it paled in comparison to the light in her eyes, a sentiment so far removed from the blunt, practical compliments of the local boys that it left her breathless. He painted pictures with his words, creating a world for her where women wore elegant gowns to dinner every evening, where stimulating conversation flowed as freely as champagne, and where one's ambitions were not a source of concern, but a celebrated virtue. He was, in every conceivable way, her golden ticket, the living embodiment of the escape she had spent years so diligently planning, and she clung to the vision he offered with a fierce, protective desperation. While he captivated with these polished daydreams, a far more insidious operation was unfolding in the sun-scorched hills and valleys surrounding the town. Men in city clothes, bearing Sterling's name and authority, began to visit the struggling ranchers, their quiet wagons rolling up to homesteads already burdened by drought and debt. They spoke the same language of progress and prosperity as their employer, but their offers were predatory, leveraging the grand, unproven promise of the railroad spur to devalue the very land that would supposedly make everyone rich, creating a palpable undercurrent of quiet desperation that, lost in her own dazzling fantasy, chose to ignore. The annual harvest dance, held in the largest barn on the outskirts of town, was a cherished tradition in Harmony Gulch, a rare occasion when the entire community set aside its hardships to celebrate the culmination of another year's toil. The air was alive with the cheerful sawing of a fiddle and the scent of hay, pine torches, and apple cider, the cavernous space filled with the sounds of laughter and the rhythmic stomp of boots on the wide-planked floor. Wearing the dusky rose dress she treasured and the new blue ribbon from Sterling woven into her braid, felt a flicker of genuine, uncomplicated happiness as she was swept into the vibrant swirl of the community. Sterling, ever attentive, was by her side, though it quickly became apparent that his Eastern polish did not extend to the rustic realities of a barn dance. He was clumsy and stiff during the waltz, his movements lacking the fluid, instinctual grace of the local men, and he looked deeply uncomfortable amidst the boisterous, unpretentious revelry, a fact that pricked its perfect image of him. Later in the evening, as she was catching her breath by the cider barrel, a familiar figure detached himself from the shadows. Edward, looking solid and strangely out of place in his clean shirt, approached her with a quiet determination, his presence a sudden, grounding force in the chaotic joy of the dance. He didn't offer a charming pleasantry, simply asking, "May I have this dance?" before the fiddler struck up a slow, heartfelt tune. In his arms, the world shifted. Where Sterling had been awkward and hesitant, Edward was a bastion of quiet confidence, his hand firm and steady on her back as he guided her across the floor with an innate knowledge of the music and the space. He didn't need to fill the silence with grand stories. Their shared history and the simple, powerful connection of the dance itself spoke volumes. For those few precious minutes under the warm, flickering lantern light, with the familiar scent of pine and clean earth surrounding them, completely forgot about San Francisco, forgot about her meticulously saved coins and her desperate need to escape, feeling only the solid strength of the man holding her and a profound, undeniable sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. But then the music ended, the spell shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the weight of her ambitions came rushing back, causing her to pull away from him with a sudden, jerky motion, her heart a battlefield of warring emotions that left her more confused and conflicted than ever before. The first whispers of something truly amiss in the valley began subtly, like a change in the wind that only the most seasoned observer would notice. The Miller family, who owned a small but well-tended farm several miles east of town, awoke one morning to find their well water had turned brackish and foul, tainted with a substance that smelled vaguely of chemicals and rendered it utterly undrinkable for both their family and their livestock. With no other source of water and their crops beginning to wither under the relentless sun, they were forced to accept a dismally low offer from one of Sterling's agents, packing their meager belongings into a wagon with expressions of defeated resignation. The incident was widely dismissed as a tragic but natural occurrence, perhaps a seam of foul minerals opened by the dry weather. A week later, however, a pillar of smoke stained the clear blue sky to the north. A fire, breaking out in the dead of night, had consumed the main barn of the Gregor homestead, a family whose patriarch, a famously stubborn man named Gregor, had publicly and profanely refused to entertain any offer for his land. While the family and their neighbors managed to save the house and most of the livestock, the loss of the barn and the winter feed stored within was a devastating blow on the cusp of the colder months. Again, the event was chalked up to misfortune, a stray spark from a lantern, a bit of lightning from a storm that never materialized, but a cold knot of fear began to tighten in the community's gut. These were not the usual hardships of prairie life. This felt different, targeted, and while most people were too afraid to voice their suspicions, Edward was not most people. He listened to the gossip in the store and the saloon, his expression growing more grim with each new detail, his innate sense of order and fairness deeply offended by the calculated cruelty of these accidents, convinced that they were anything but. While the townsfolk huddled together, speaking in hushed and worried tones, Edward took action, his quiet investigation driven by a cold, simmering anger and a deep-seated instinct to protect his own. He saddled his horse and rode out to the Miller farm, now deserted, the silence of the place heavy with loss. He spent over an hour meticulously circling the fouled well, his eyes scanning the ground for anything out of the ordinary, and his patience was eventually rewarded. Tucked deep within a thicket of overgrown brush, shielded from casual view, lay a small, nearly full pouch made of soft leather and cinched with a silk cord. It contained expensive, aromatic tobacco, a city brand that sold for a small fortune and was entirely unlike the rough, cheap shag favored by farmers like Miller. The next day, he made the long ride to the Gregor place, offering his help in clearing the charred and blackened debris of the barn. Amidst the ashes and soot-stained timber, while sifting through the wreckage, his fingers closed around a small, cold piece of metal. It was a nail, but it was perfectly smooth and uniform, a machine-made nail identical to those Sterling's men were using for their new survey markers, a stark contrast to the rough, hand-forged nails used in the construction of every other building in the valley, including the rest of the Gregor homestead. Armed with his two small, damning pieces of evidence, he confronted late one afternoon in the quiet of the store, laying the tobacco pouch and the nail on the counter between them. He explained his findings in a low, steady voice, his logic clear and his conviction absolute, but the evidence was purely circumstantial. When the sheriff, a man who preferred a quiet life, questioned Sterling about his whereabouts on the nights in question, the investor produced a seamless alibi, supported by his visiting agents, and smoothly expressed his deep sympathies for the afflicted families. Sterling's flawless performance, coupled with Edward's lack of a confession or a direct witness, made the rancher look like a petty and jealous local, grasping at straws to discredit a rival for a woman's affections. Was left standing in the crossfire, caught in an agonizing limbo between the glittering, beautiful dreams Sterling offered and the terrifying, compelling truth that she saw burning in Edward's unwavering eyes. The thin veneer of civility that held Harmony Gulch together finally cracked and shattered with the discovery of old man Hemlock's body, an event that sent a tremor of pure, undiluted fear through the heart of the community. Hemlock had been a fixture of the valley for 50 years, a man as gnarled and unyielding as the ancient oaks on his property, a property that happened to control the main artery of the creek that fed the entire northern range. He was found by a neighbor in his small, isolated cabin, the place ransacked to crudely simulate a robbery gone wrong, but no one was fooled. A man like Hemlock, who was known to be as poor as a church mouse and twice as stubborn, would have sooner died of starvation than keep more than $2 in his home, and the brutal, excessive nature of his death spoke not of a desperate thief, but of a cold and calculated message. A palpable silence descended upon the town, thick with suspicion and the chilling realization that the mysterious accidents plaguing them had escalated into something far more sinister. Sterling, ever the opportunist, moved through this new landscape of terror like a wolf circling a wounded herd, his expression a mask of deep, civic-minded concern that barely concealed the predatory gleam in his eyes. He convened a town meeting in the saloon, his voice resonating with manufactured authority as he decried the sudden tide of lawlessness, and painted a grim picture of a town teetering on the brink of chaos, a town that desperately needed the stability and protection that only a powerful, outside entity like his company could provide. He spoke of organized security and immediate, generous buyouts for anyone wishing to leave this now dangerous territory, and his words, which once seemed so full of promise, now felt like a silken threat, pressuring the remaining landowners to surrender their homes and their heritage out of sheer terror. Found herself adrift in this sea of communal fear, the conflict within her raging more fiercely than ever before. Edward's warnings echoed in her mind, his grim certainty now seeming horribly prescient, yet she still clung to the fragment of the dream Sterling had so carefully crafted for her. That evening, seeking refuge from the oppressive atmosphere of the store, she found her father in the sitting room, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the fading light. He was holding an old, tarnished silver locket, his expression lost in a sea of memory, and he looked up at her with eyes clouded by a grief that felt both old and new again. He asked her, his voice soft and heavy, if she would finally help him clear the large steamer trunk that had belonged to her mother, a task they had both put off for years, as if by leaving it untouched, they could somehow keep a part of her tangible and present. Seeing the profound weariness in her father's face, agreed without hesitation, welcoming the distraction from her own troubled thoughts. Together, they carried the heavy trunk from the attic, its leather straps dry and cracked with age. As she lifted the lid, the scent of lavender and time-worn fabric filled the room. The trunk was a time capsule of a life she had only known in pieces, filled with folded lace, a pair of tiny, worn baby shoes, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Near the bottom, nestled amongst a collection of dried flowers, her fingers brushed against the cool, smooth leather of a small, handsome diary, its cover embossed with a single, elegant A for her mother's name. A feeling of profound intimacy and trespass washed over her as she held it, a secret history resting in the palm of her hand. With her father's quiet, encouraging nod, she sat down by the window and opened the book, the pages whispering as she turned them, her mother's beautiful, flowing script covering every inch of paper. At first, the entries were a simple chronicle of a young woman's life in a town not so different from the Harmony Gulch of today, filled with descriptions of social events, frustrations with her own stern father, and dreams of a more exciting world. But then, the tone shifted, the writing becoming more hurried, more vibrant, infused with the breathless excitement of a secret whirlwind romance. Her mother wrote of a charming, ambitious young man from the East who had swept into her life like a summer storm, a man who spoke of incredible ventures and a future paved with gold, a man who saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. As blood began to run cold as she read on, her mother's words a terrifying mirror of her own recent experiences. The diary detailed how this charismatic stranger had completely captivated her grandfather, convincing the stern, practical man to invest the family's entire savings, a considerable sum at the time, into a railroad scheme that promised to make them all wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Then, the entries stopped abruptly. The last few pages were blank, but tucked into the back cover was a folded, tear-stained letter from her grandfather's lawyer, starkly detailing how the investment had been a fraud and the charming young man had vanished without a trace, leaving her family utterly destitute and her mother heartbroken. As shaking hands reached the final page of the diary, a small, stiff square of cardboard slipped from between the leaves and fell into her lap. It was a tintype photograph, its edges worn and its surface slightly faded, showing her mother as a radiant young woman standing beside a man. He was younger, his face leaner, But there was no mistaking the smug, self-satisfied curve of his lips or the cold, calculating ambition in his eyes. It was Sterling. The diary wasn't just a story of a swindler. It was a confession, an indictment, a ghost story that had just stepped into the light, revealing that the man who had promised the world was the very same man who had stolen it from her mother. In an instant, the entire world tilted on its axis, the gilded cage of her dreams shattering to reveal the rusty, iron bars of a monstrous truth. Every kind word from Sterling, every flattering promise, every shared glance now seemed grotesque, a calculated and cruel manipulation by a man who had been playing a long and vengeful game. This wasn't about progress or bringing prosperity to Harmony Gulch. It was a final, vindictive act of destruction. He had returned not to build, but to conquer, to systematically ruin the lives of the people here, to seize the land and the legacy he felt had been to him all those years ago. The fouled well, the burned barn, the murder of old man Hemlock, they were all strategic, heartless moves designed to dismantle the community piece by piece until he owned it all. A final, triumphant revenge on the memory of the family who had, in his twisted view, wronged him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. And at that exact moment, a lonesome, mournful sound echoed through the valley, the whistle of the evening train, its imminent departure a signal that Sterling, his deeds done and his victory assured, was about to slip away just as he had done a generation before, leaving another wave of ruin in his wake. A surge of pure, unadulterated fury replaced her shock. He would not get away with it. Not again. Panicked and desperate, she didn't run to the sheriff, who had already been so easily swayed by Sterling's charm, nor to her father, who was too lost in his own grief. She ran to the only person she knew who possessed the strength and conviction to see this through, the only person she knew, with absolute certainty, would believe her. Her frantic ride to the Double Bar Ranch was a blur of thundering hooves and choking dust, her heart pounding in time with her horse's frantic gallop. She found Edward in his barn, mending a bridle with methodical, focused movements, his face grim in the fading light. He looked up, startled by her wild-eyed, disheveled appearance, and his simmering anger over their last encounter instantly evaporated, replaced by alarm. Wordlessly, gasping for breath, she thrust the leather-bound diary and the faded tintype into his hands. He took them, his expression shifting from confusion to rapt attention as he listened to her pour out the story in a torrent of frantic, broken sentences. He scanned the elegant script of the diary, his jaw tightening with every word, and when he finally looked at the photograph, his quiet suspicion, which had been smoldering for weeks, erupted into a blaze of cold, hard fury. He looked from the image of the young, smug swindler to his terrified face, and in that instant, the wedge that had been driven between them dissolved into nothing. They were no longer a conflicted girl and a resentful rancher. They were a unified force, bound by a shared purpose and a righteous anger. Without another word, he strode to his stallion, swinging into the saddle with a powerful grace, and turned the horse toward town. Wheeled her own mount to follow, and they rode side by side, their horses stretching into a dead run against the setting sun. Two lone figures racing against time to intercept a train and unmask a devil before he could disappear into the night, leaving their town in ashes. The chaotic scene at the train station dissolved into a kind of stunned, righteous order, the simmering anger of the crowd finally finding a legitimate target in the now exposed Sterling. His charismatic facade had crumbled completely, leaving only a bitter, defeated man whose fine suit looked absurdly out of place as the sheriff, his face a grim mask of duty he could no longer shirk, snapped iron cuffs around his wrists. The murmurs of the townsfolk swelled into a chorus of outrage and relief as the full scope of his deception, laid bare by the raw, undeniable truth of his diary, and the damning physical evidence Edward had collected, washed over them. Men who had been on the verge of selling their ancestral lands for pennies on the dollar stared at Sterling with a mixture of fury and profound gratitude for their narrow escape, while women who had been charmed by his Eastern polish now looked upon him with cold contempt. In the midst of it all, and Edward stood slightly apart, the adrenaline of their desperate ride and the public confrontation slowly draining away, leaving behind a profound sense of shared exhaustion and a fragile, unspoken connection forged in the crucible of the evening's events. As the sheriff led Sterling away, a path parting through the crowd for them, felt the weight of the town's collective gaze upon her. But for the first time, it didn't feel like the pressure of a cage, but rather a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of the courage it had taken to speak the truth her mother never could. The train, its schedule hopelessly delayed, finally hissed a great sigh of steam and began to pull away from the station, its lonesome whistle no longer sounding like a call to escape, but like a mournful farewell to a future she now knew she had never truly wanted. In the days and weeks that followed Sterling's arrest, a remarkable transformation began to sweep through Harmony Gulch, as the fear and suspicion that had poisoned the community were slowly burned away by a renewed spirit of unity and mutual reliance. The reckoning had been harsh, but it had served as a powerful reminder that their strength lay not in isolation, but in their shared roots and collective will. Neighbors who had been eyeing each other with distrust were now working shoulder to shoulder, raising the frame of the Gregors' new barn under the hot sun, their combined labor a testament to their resilience. The Miller family was brought back to their homestead, their well laboriously cleared and cleaned by a dozen willing hands, their fields plowed and reseeded by men who asked for nothing in return. Found herself at the very center of this communal rebirth, her role evolving far beyond that of a simple storekeeper's daughter. She was no longer watching life happen from behind a counter, but was an active participant in the town's healing, her hands becoming calloused from mending fences and her face tanned from long days spent helping to replant scorched gardens. She listened, truly listened, to the stories of the people she had known her entire life, hearing not the monotonous drone of small-town gossip, but the intricate histories of survival and quiet dignity. She saw the fierce pride in Mrs. Gregor's eyes as the final rafter of the new barn was hoisted into place, and she felt the profound gratitude in Mr. Miller's handshake, realizing that the value of this place wasn't something you could count in coins and store in a tin box. It was a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary built not of wood and stone, but of unwavering loyalty and hard-won hope, and she was, to her own astonishment, inextricably a part of it. Her interactions with Edward underwent a similar, profound transformation, the old, comfortable patterns of teasing and exasperation giving way to a quiet, powerful intimacy that neither of them felt the need to name. The barriers between them, built of her restless ambition and his guarded affection, had been demolished, leaving a clear and open space for something new to grow. They often worked together during the town's rebuilding efforts, moving with an easy, unspoken synergy that felt as natural as breathing. He would anticipate her need for a hammer, and she would have a cup of water ready for him before he even realized his own thirst. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space of understanding, filled with the comfortable weight of all that had transpired. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, he found her on the porch of the general store, methodically sweeping away the day's dust. He didn't speak at first, simply taking the splintered rail of the porch and beginning to sand it smooth with a piece of scrap wood, his large, capable hands moving with a gentle precision. They worked in that companionable quiet for a long while, the rhythmic rasp of the wood being the only sound besides the chirping of the crickets. He saw the new strength in her posture, the calm confidence in her eyes, and his long-held affection deepened into a profound respect for the woman she had become. She, in turn, saw past the rugged rancher, the fixture of the town she had once so resented, and recognized the unwavering pillar of integrity and quiet strength who had seen the truth when no one else would, and had stood by her without question when it mattered most. Later that night, stood in the familiar quiet of her own bedroom, the soft moonlight filtering through the window and falling across the dusty floorboards. Her gaze fell upon the small, loose board beneath her bed, and with a sense of finality, she knelt and pulled out the old biscuit tin. It felt surprisingly heavy in her hands, a tangible weight of all her past dreams and desperate yearnings. She lifted the lid, the clink of the coins a soft, metallic sound in the stillness, and beside the hoard of currency lay the crisp, clean edge of the train ticket to San Francisco she had purchased in secret weeks ago. She picked it up, the promise of its destination, which had once seemed so vibrant and essential, now feeling like a pale and distant echo of a girl she no longer was. The glittering, anonymous fantasy of the city, with its grand theaters and faceless crowds, seemed hollow when weighed against the tangible, hard-won reality of her life now. The satisfaction of a day's meaningful labor, the genuine warmth in a neighbor's smile, the deep, grounding feeling of belonging, and the steady, unwavering presence of Edward. She finally understood that the cage she had been so desperate to escape had never been the town itself, but her own perception of it. Freedom, she realized with breathtaking clarity, wasn't a destination you could travel to on a train. It was the quiet, internal power to choose where you belonged and to build a life you were proud of. A soft footstep on the porch drew her from her reverie. She walked out into the cool night air to find Edward leaning against the post, his hat in his hands, his silhouette dark against the star-dusted sky. He didn't ask her what she had decided or what her plans were, avoiding any question that might pressure her. Instead, he looked out at the quiet, sleeping town, his voice low and laced with a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. This place. It's a good place filled with good people, he began, his gaze sweeping over the rooftops. It would be a whole lot better with you in it, but wherever you go, I just hope you find what you're looking for. He finally turned to face her, his eyes earnest and clear in the moonlight, finally letting down the last of his guards. I've wanted you to stay forever, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I want your happiness more. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy that reached her eyes and made them shine. She looked from his honest, open face to the town, her town, and knew with every fiber of her being that she was already home. I think, she said softly, closing the small distance between them, I've already found it. With a deliberate, graceful motion, she tore the train ticket in half, the two pieces fluttering from her fingers like freed birds, landing silently in the dust of the street below. In the profound quiet of the western night, he drew her in, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was not a spark of passion but a slow, deep burn, a promise not of a life without hardship, but of a life faced together forever, right here.